need to tell you something that happened to me 3 months ago, something that still wakes me up screaming in the middle of the night. I know how this is going to sound. I know you're going to think I'm crazy or making this up for attention. But I have scars on my wrists that won't heal properly, and there's a human skull sitting in a cave somewhere in northern Minnesota that proves every word I'm about to tell you is true. What I experienced in those woods changed everything I thought I knew about the world. There are things living in the deep wilderness that shouldn't exist, creatures that our science books say are impossible. But they're real, they're intelligent, and they're hungry. I barely escaped with my life, and I'm only alive right now because of luck and desperation. Before this happened, I never believed in monsters. Growing up in Chicago, the only scary things I dealt with were rush hour traffic and my demanding job at the marketing firm. After 5 years of 14-hour days and barely seeing sunlight, I desperately needed an escape. My therapist kept telling me to find ways to disconnect, to get away from the constant noise and pressure. So when my vacation time finally came around, I decided to do something completely different. I booked a solo hiking trip to the remote wilderness of northern Minnesota, far from cell towers and city lights. The plan was simple: 4 days of hiking and camping in the Superior National Forest, where I could finally hear myself think. I'd done some camping before with friends, nothing too serious, but I felt confident enough to handle a few days alone in the woods. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, enough food for the trip, and a good knife just in case I ran into any wildlife. The ranger at the station warned me about black bears and told me to keep my food sealed, but otherwise said the area was pretty safe for experienced hikers. I started my hike on a Thursday morning in late September. The weather was perfect: crispy autumn air, clear skies, and the leaves were just starting to turn those brilliant reds and golds you see in postcards. The trail wound through thick forests of pine and maple, following an old logging road that hadn't been used in decades. After about 6 miles, I found the perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing next to a stream surrounded by towering trees that created a natural windbreak. That first day was everything I'd hoped for. I set up my tent, cooked a simple dinner over my camp stove, and spent the evening just sitting by the water listening to the sounds of the forest. No car horns, no sirens, no constant buzz of the city. Just the gentle babbling of the stream and the occasional call of a loon in the distance. For the first time in months, I felt truly relaxed. I crawled into my tent around 10 and slept better than I had in years. The next morning, I woke up refreshed and ready to explore more of the area. After breakfast, I decided to hike a bit further from my campsite to see what else was around. About half a mile upstream, I discovered something interesting: an old log cabin tucked back in the trees, almost completely hidden by overgrown brush and fallen branches. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. The cabin was small but solid, built from thick pine logs that had weathered to a dark gray. The roof was partially caved in on one side, but the main structure looked intact. There were no windows, just openings where glass might have been once, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Moss covered most of the north-facing wall, and vines had started climbing up the sides. It was like something out of a fairy tale, forgotten by time. I pushed open the creaky door and peered inside. The interior was surprisingly dry, with a dirt floor and stone fireplace along one wall. Someone had left behind a few pieces of furniture: a rough wooden table, a chair with 3 legs, and what looked like the remains of a bed frame. There were old beer bottles scattered around and some rusted cans, but nothing recent. It felt like stepping back in time 50 years or more. The more I looked at it, the more appealing the cabin became. It would be so much more comfortable than sleeping in my tent, and there was something romantic about staying in this forgotten piece of history. The roof over the main room was completely intact, and the fireplace looked like it might still work. I could gather some firewood and actually have a real fire instead of just my little camp stove. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning out the cabin, sweeping debris from the floor, and clearing spider webs from the corners. By afternoon, I'd moved all my gear from the campsite to my new shelter. I gathered dry wood from the surrounding forest and managed to get a fire going in the old fireplace. The stone chimney drew perfectly, filling the cabin with warmth and the comforting smell of wood smoke. That evening felt magical. I cooked my dinner over the open fire and sat at the old wooden table eating by firelight. The cabin felt cozy and safe, like I was the first person to appreciate it in decades. I imagined who might have lived here before, maybe a trapper or a logger from the early 1900s. Outside, the forest was completely quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I banked the fire before going to bed, rolling out my sleeping bag on the dirt floor near the fireplace. The temperature had dropped considerably after sunset, and I was grateful to be inside rather than in my tent. I felt completely at peace, more relaxed than I'd been in years. This was exactly what I needed: total isolation, complete silence, and a chance to reconnect with something more basic and real than my complicated city life. But that peace didn't last long. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to strange sounds outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but there was no wind that night. The sounds were rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but too heavy to be human. They circled the cabin slowly, deliberately, like something was investigating my presence. Then I heard the grunting. It was low and deep, definitely not from any animal I recognized. It sounded almost human, but not quite, like someone with a severe speech impediment trying to communicate. The grunts came in patterns, sometimes short and sharp, sometimes longer and more drawn out. Whatever was making them was large. I could tell from the way the sounds resonated through the forest. My heart started pounding as I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, straining to listen. The footsteps continued around the cabin, sometimes stopping right outside the doorway. At one point, I heard what sounded like sniffing, like a large animal trying to catch my scent. The grunting sound seemed to be coming from multiple sources now, as if there were several creatures out there communicating with each other. I wanted desperately to look outside to see what was making these sounds, but something instinctive told me to stay hidden. Every survival instinct I had was screaming danger. These weren't the sounds of any normal forest animal, not bears, not deer, not anything I'd ever heard before. There was an intelligence behind them that was deeply unsettling. The investigation went on for what felt like hours. Sometimes the sounds would fade away into the distance, and I'd think whatever it was had left. Then they'd return, closer than before, more persistent. I heard scratching sounds against the log walls, like something was testing the structure. At one point, something large bumped against the door hard enough to make the whole frame shake. I gripped my knife handle, but knew it would be useless against whatever was out there. All I could do was lie still and hope they would lose interest and move on. Eventually, the sounds did fade away, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there listening to every creak and rustle, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. When dawn finally broke, I felt exhausted and shaky. The morning light filtering through the door opening seemed to wash away some of the terror from the night before, but I knew I hadn't imagined what happened. Something had definitely been investigating the cabin, and it wasn't any animal I was familiar with. I forced myself to eat breakfast, though I had little appetite. My hands were still trembling slightly as I made coffee over the rekindled fire. In the rational light of day, I tried to convince myself it had been bears or maybe a moose, but deep down I knew that wasn't right. The sounds had been too organized, too purposeful. After breakfast, I gathered my courage and stepped outside to look around. What I found made my blood run cold. There were tracks everywhere in the soft earth around the cabin. At first glance, they looked almost human, the basic shape of a foot with 5 toes. But they were enormous, at least twice the size of my own feet, and much wider. The impressions were deep, indicating something incredibly heavy had made them. I knelt down and measured one with my hand. It was nearly 18 inches long. The tracks circled the entire cabin multiple times, just as I'd suspected from the sounds the night before. There were several different sets, suggesting at least 3 or 4 individuals. Some of the prints showed claw marks at the tips of the toes, and all of them had a stride length that was impossibly long for any human. I followed the tracks away from the cabin and found where they led into the forest. They followed game trails and creek beds, always taking the path of least resistance through the thick underbrush. At one point, I found a sapling that had been snapped in half about 8 feet off the ground, the break still fresh and oozing sap. The evidence was undeniable, something very large, very powerful, and walking on 2 legs had spent hours investigating my presence. Whatever these creatures were, they were unlike anything in the nature documentaries or field guides. I thought about the old stories I'd heard growing up, tales of Bigfoot and Sasquatch that I'd always dismissed as folklore. Suddenly, those stories didn't seem so ridiculous. Fear began to override my curiosity. I was alone in the wilderness, miles from the nearest road, with no cell phone service and no way to contact help. If these creatures decided I was a threat, or worse, prey, there was nothing I could do to stop them. I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I rushed back to the cabin and started packing my gear. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my sleeping bag into its compression sack and rolled up my ground pad. I abandoned any attempt at organization, just throwing everything into my backpack as fast as possible. The fire was still burning in the fireplace, but I didn't take time to properly extinguish it. I just scattered the logs and poured my remaining coffee over the coals. As I was cinching down the straps on my pack, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, moving fast and coming directly toward the cabin. Not the careful, investigative movement from the night before. This was the sound of something large running at full speed. I grabbed my pack and bolted toward the door, but I was too late. Something massive slammed into me from behind before I could even turn around. The impact felt like being hit by a freight train. My pack went flying, and I crashed face first into the dirt floor of the cabin. Pain exploded through my head as something hard struck the back of my skull and everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I knew immediately that I was somewhere completely different. Gone was the familiar interior of the cabin, replaced by the cool dampness of stone walls and the musty smell of earth and decay. My head throbbed with a splitting headache, and my vision was blurry as I tried to focus on my surroundings. I was in a cave, sitting upright against a rough stone wall. My hands were bound behind my back, not with rope, but with what felt like thick vines or roots twisted together. The bindings were surprisingly secure, tied with a skill that suggested intelligence and experience. My legs were free, but when I tried to move, waves of dizziness washed over me. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from somewhere deeper in the cave, I began to make out the details of my prison. The floor was littered with bones, hundreds of them scattered across the stone surface like macabre decorations. Most appeared to be from animals, the long leg bones of deer, the curved ribs of what might have been elk, the smaller bones of rabbits and other forest creatures. But among the animal remains, I spotted something that made my heart stop. Partially hidden under a pile of deer bones was the unmistakable curve of a human skull, yellowed with age, but still clearly recognizable. The empty eye sockets seemed to stare directly at me, and I could see where the jaw had been separated from the rest of the skull. I wasn't the first person to end up in this place. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These creatures, whatever they were carnivores. This cave was like a pantry or storage room where they kept their food. The bones scattered around me represented meals from months or years past, and the human skull meant they weren't particular about what kind of meat they consumed. Terror overwhelmed me as I understood my situation. I wasn't being held captive for ransom or interrogation. I was being kept fresh until mealtime. From deeper in the cave system, I could hear the grunting sounds I'd recognized from the night before. There were multiple voices having what sounded almost like conversations in their primitive language. Sometimes the grunts would rise in pitch and volume, as if they were arguing or excited about something. The sounds echoed off the stone walls, making it impossible to tell exactly how many there were or how far away they might be. I tested my bonds, trying to work my hands free, but the vine ropes were too tight and too well secured. Whoever had tied me up knew what they were doing. The more I struggled, the tighter the binding seemed to become, cutting into my wrists and cutting off circulation to my fingers. Then I heard heavy footsteps approaching through the cave tunnels, growing louder with each step. I froze, trying to make myself as small and inconspicuous as possible against the stone wall. The grunting sounds grew closer, and soon I could see a massive shadow moving in the dim light. What emerged from the darkness was beyond anything I could have imagined. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, with a body covered in thick, dark hair from head to toe. Its proportions were almost human, but exaggerated in every dimension. Massive shoulders, arm that hung past its knees, hands the size of dinner plates. The head was distinctly ape-like, with a heavy brow ridge, flattened nose, and a mouth that protruded in a muzzle-like snout. But what struck me most were its eyes. They weren't the simple, instinct-driven eyes of an animal. There was intelligence there, curiosity, and something that might have been recognition. This was no mindless beast. It was a thinking being, which somehow made the situation even more terrifying. The creature approached me slowly, moving with surprising grace for something so large. It knelt down next to me, bringing its massive head close to mine. I could smell its breath, a mixture of raw meat and something wild and musky. Its nostrils flared as it investigated my scent, sniffing along my hair and neck like a dog getting familiar with a new person. Then, it did something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It reached out with one enormous hand and gently grasped my arm. Its grip was careful, almost delicate, as if it understood exactly how fragile I was compared to its strength. Then it brought my hand up to its mouth and licked my palm with a tongue that felt like wet sandpaper. It was tasting me. The creature held my hand for several long seconds, rolling my fingers between its lips like it was savoring the flavor. Its eyes never left mine during this process, studying my reactions with what seemed like scientific curiosity. Then, apparently satisfied with its examination, it released my hand and stood up. Without any further acknowledgement of my presence, it turned and walked back into the deeper parts of the cave system. I could hear its footsteps fading away, followed by more grunting sounds as it apparently communicated with the others about what it had discovered. I was left alone with the horrible knowledge that I'd just been evaluated like a piece of meat in a butcher shop. The creature had been checking my condition, maybe determining how fresh I was or when I might be ready for consumption. The careful, almost clinical way it had examined me suggested this was a routine they performed many times before. Looking around at all the bones scattered across the cave floor, I tried to imagine how many other people had sat in this same spot, tied up and helpless, waiting for their fate. The human skull couldn't have been the only one. There were probably other remains mixed in with all the animal bones, too broken down or scattered to be easily identified. But even in my terror, I noticed something important about my bindings. The vines that held my hands were organic, not manufactured rope or wire. They were strong but not indestructible. If I could find a way to abrade them against something sharp or rough, I might be able to wear through them given enough time. The cave walls around me were rough stone, carved by water over thousands of years. There were sharp edges and abrasive surfaces everywhere. If I could position myself correctly and work quietly enough to avoid attracting attention, I might be able to scrape through the vine ropes. I scooted closer to the wall behind me, feeling for the roughest section of stone I could find. There was a protruding edge about shoulder height that felt sharp enough to cut through organic material if I rubbed against it long enough. The challenge would be doing it silently while the creatures were somewhere nearby in the cave system. I started working immediately, rubbing the vines against the sharp stone with small, careful movements. The work was slow and exhausting, requiring me to contort my arms into uncomfortable positions while trying to maintain steady pressure. My shoulders ached and the rough stone scraped against my wrists, but gradually I could feel the fibers starting to separate. The grunting sounds from deeper in the cave continued sporadically, sometimes closer and sometimes farther away. I paused my work whenever the sounds grew louder, afraid that one of the creatures might return to check on me. During these breaks, I studied my surroundings more carefully, looking for anything that might help me escape. The cave I was in appeared to be a natural limestone formation, carved by underground water flow over geological time. The ceiling was high and irregular, disappearing into shadows above my head. The floor sloped downward toward the back of the cave, where the sounds were coming from, suggesting that the tunnel system extended much deeper into the earth. But what gave me hope was a faint glimmer of natural light coming from somewhere off to my left. It was very dim, barely visible, but it suggested there might be another entrance to the cave system, possibly my way out if I could get free and reach it without being detected. As I continued working on my bonds, I also noticed other details that confirmed the intelligence of my captors. Scattered among the bones were crude tools made from shaped stones and carved wood. There were also decorations of sorts, arrangements of feathers and small bones that seemed to serve no practical purpose beyond ornamentation. These creatures had a culture, primitive but real. Most disturbing were the trophies. Mixed in with the animal remains were clearly human artifacts, a torn piece of fabric that might have been from a shirt, a plastic water bottle gnawed beyond recognition, and what looked like a broken wristwatch. Each item represented someone who had ended up in this cave before me, someone who had never made it out. The thought of becoming just another trophy in their collection motivated me to work faster on my escape. The vines were definitely weakening, individual fibers snapping with each movement against the sharp stone. My wrists were raw and bleeding from the abrasion, but I could feel the binding starting to loosen. After what felt like hours of careful work, I finally felt the last few strands give way. My hands were free. I flexed my fingers, trying to restore circulation and rub my abraded wrists. The pain was intense, but the relief of being unbound was overwhelming. Now came the harder part, getting out of the cave without being detected. I stood up slowly, fighting another wave of dizziness from my head injury. My legs were stiff from sitting in one position for so long, and I had to steady myself against the wall while feeling return to my feet. Every movement felt loud in the echoing cave, though I tried to be as quiet as possible. The grunting sounds from deeper in the tunnel system had quieted down, which might mean the creatures were sleeping or resting. This could be my best chance to explore and find a way out. I oriented myself toward the faint light source I'd noticed earlier and began moving carefully across the bone-littered floor. Each step required careful placement to avoid crushing bones underfoot. The sound of snapping ribs or skull fragments would certainly alert my captors to my escape attempt. I tested each footfall before putting my full weight down, sometimes having to backtrack when I encountered an unstable pile of remains. The source of the dim light turned out to be a narrow passage that led upward through the stone. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but daylight was definitely filtering down from somewhere above. This had to be another entrance to the cave system, probably hidden by vegetation or rock formations on the surface. As I started up the narrow passage, I could see more evidence of the creature's presence. The walls were marked with scratches that might have been crude drawings or territorial markers. There were also hollowed-out niches carved into the stone where various objects were stored. More bone tools, bundles of dried vegetation that might have been food, and collections of stones sorted by size and shape. The intelligence displayed in these arrangements was unsettling. These weren't mindless monsters, but thinking beings with their own technology and social structure. They organized their living space, created tools, and apparently had some form of art or communication system. In many ways, they were more like a primitive human tribe than wild animals. But that didn't make them any less dangerous. If anything, their intelligence made them more formidable predators. They could plan, set traps, and coordinate their hunting efforts. They had probably been observing human activity in the area for years, learning our patterns and weaknesses. The passage continued upward for what felt like 50 feet or more, sometimes so narrow I had to turn sideways to squeeze through, other times opening into small chambers before continuing upward. The air gradually became fresher and the light grew stronger. I was definitely heading toward the surface. As I climbed, I began to hear new sounds from below and behind me. The grunting voices were becoming more agitated, more urgent. They had discovered my escape. The sounds echoed up through the passage, distorted by the stone walls, but clearly indicating alarm and anger. I moved faster, no longer concerned about stealth. Speed was more important now than silence. I could hear heavy footsteps in the cave below, multiple individuals moving around rapidly. They were searching for me, and it would only be a matter of time before they found the passage I was using. The tunnel took a sharp turn to the right, and suddenly I could see real daylight ahead. The opening was partially concealed by hanging vines and fallen branches, but beyond them I could see trees and sky. I was almost out. I pushed through the vegetation and emerged into the forest, gasping with relief at being back in the open air. The sun was low in the sky, suggesting I'd been unconscious and imprisoned for most of the day. I had maybe 2 or 3 hours of daylight left to put as much distance as possible between myself and the cave. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. Deep, angry roars echoed from the cave entrance, and I could hear the creatures moving through the tunnel system with frightening speed. They would be after me within minutes. I looked around quickly, trying to orient myself. The forest here was thicker and more primitive than where I'd been camping, with massive, old-growth trees and dense underbrush. I had no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization, but I remembered that I'd been hiking generally westward when I found the cabin. If I could keep the setting sun in front of me, I should eventually reach the trail system or a road. The sounds from the cave were getting closer, accompanied now by the crashing of vegetation as the creatures emerged onto the surface. I couldn't see them yet, but I could hear at least 3 or 4 different voices, all clearly agitated and searching. I started moving as quickly as I could through the forest, trying to balance speed with stealth. Every few steps, I paused to listen for pursuit, but the creatures were making no effort to be quiet. They crashed through the underbrush like bulldozers, snapping branches and grunting to each other as they spread out to search for me. The terrain was rough and uneven, full of fallen logs, rocky outcroppings, and dense thickets that forced me to constantly change direction. My progress was frustratingly slow, while behind me the sounds of pursuit seemed to be gaining ground. These creatures knew their territory far better than I did, and their longer stride meant they could cover ground much faster. After about 20 minutes of running, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A long, loud howl echoed through the forest. Not quite human, not quite animal, but clearly a signal of some kind. It was answered almost immediately by similar calls from different directions. They were coordinating their search, communicating my position to each other. I was being hunted by a pack of intelligent predators in their own territory. I had no weapons, no knowledge of the area, and no way to call for help. My only advantages were my smaller size, which allowed me to move through dense vegetation more easily, and my desperation. The howling continued periodically, always seeming to come from closer than before. Sometimes I could hear the heavy footsteps of my pursuers crashing through the forest nearby. Once I caught a glimpse of a massive, dark shape moving between the trees less than 100 yards away. The creature was easily keeping pace with me despite the thick undergrowth. I needed a new strategy. I couldn't outrun them in a straight chase, and they seemed to be herding me in a particular direction. I had to find a way to hide or confuse my trail long enough to escape their immediate search area. That's when I remembered something from nature documentaries about how prey animals avoid predators. I needed to mask my scent and find a hiding place where I could wait out their initial search. If I could remain hidden long enough, they might eventually give up and return to their cave. I came to a small stream running through a rocky depression in the forest floor. This was perfect. The water would help mask my scent, and the rocky stream bed would leave fewer tracks than the soft forest floor. I waded into the cold water and started following the stream downhill, hoping it would eventually lead to a larger body of water. As I walked through the stream, I scooped up handfuls of mud and rubbed it all over my exposed skin and clothing. The mud was cold and disgusting, full of decomposing leaves and aquatic insects, but it would help mask my human scent. I covered my face, arms, and hair, trying to make myself smell more like the forest and less like prey. The stream led me to a small, marshy area where several waterways converged. The ground here was boggy and unstable, covered with fallen trees and thick vegetation. Perfect for hiding, but treacherous to navigate. I picked my way carefully through the marsh, looking for a suitable hiding spot. I found it in the form of a massive fallen oak tree. The trunk had split when it fell, creating a hollow space inside that was just large enough for a person to crawl into. The opening was partially concealed by hanging branches and marsh grass, and the interior was dry despite being surrounded by swampy ground. I squeezed into the hollow trunk and arranged the vegetation to better conceal the opening. From inside, I could see out through small gaps in the branches, but anyone passing by would have to look very carefully to spot me. The space was cramped and uncomfortable, but it felt secure. Almost immediately after I settled into my hiding place, I heard the pursuit getting closer. The howling calls were much louder now, coming from multiple directions around the marsh. Heavy footsteps splashed through the water, and I could hear the creatures grunting to each other as they searched. Through my concealed view, I caught my first clear look at my pursuers. 3 of them were visible at different points around the marsh, each one terrifyingly massive. They stood upright like humans, but were covered head to toe in dark, shaggy hair. Their movements were fluid and powerful, showing none of the clumsiness I would have expected from such large creatures. What struck me most was how systematically they were searching. This wasn't random wandering, but an organized hunt. They spread out to cover more ground, communicated with each other through their grunting calls, and investigated every potential hiding spot with thorough attention. They were checking under fallen logs, behind rock formations, and in dense thickets. Exactly the kinds of places a human would try to hide. One of them approached my hiding spot, and I held my breath as it passed within 10 feet of the fallen oak. It paused, sniffing the air carefully, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it had detected my scent. But the mud covering must have worked. After a few seconds, it moved on to investigate other areas. The search continued for hours. Sometimes the creatures would move away, and I'd think they had given up, only to have them return a few minutes later to check areas they'd already searched. Their persistence was incredible and deeply disturbing. This was clearly not the first time they'd hunted escape prey through this forest. As darkness fell, I began to hope that they might abandon the search until morning. But these creatures seemed to be as comfortable in the dark as they were in daylight. I could still hear them moving around the marsh, their calls echoing through the night air. If anything, they seemed more active after sunset. The temperature dropped significantly as the night progressed, and my mud-covered clothes offered little warmth. I was shivering constantly, trying to stay quiet while my teeth chattered involuntarily. The cramped space of the hollow log was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, but I didn't dare move to stretch or adjust my position. Around what I guessed was midnight, the search seemed to intensify. The creatures were calling to each other more frequently, and their movements became more urgent. Had they found some trace of my trail, or were they simply frustrated by their inability to locate me? One of them returned to the area around my hiding spot, moving more slowly and carefully than before. It stopped directly in front of the fallen oak and remained motionless for several minutes. I could hear its breathing, deep, steady inhalations that seemed to be analyzing every scent in the area. For what felt like an eternity, we remained frozen in place, the creature searching, me hiding just a few feet away. I was sure it could hear my heartbeat, which seemed impossibly loud in the silence. My muscles were cramped and aching, but I forced myself to remain absolutely still. Finally, the creature moved on, but I could still hear it nearby, continuing its methodical search. The night stretched on endlessly, filled with the constant threat of discovery. Every sound made me flinch. Every moment of silence made me wonder if they were getting closer. Gradually, as the hours passed, the search sounds became more distant. The creatures were expanding their search area, moving farther from the marsh to look for me. This gave me hope that my hiding strategy was working. But I didn't dare emerge yet. I needed to be absolutely certain they were gone before risking movement. Dawn came slowly, filtering through the forest canopy in pale gray light. I had been hiding in the log for over 12 hours, and my body was stiff and numb from the cold and cramped conditions. But I was alive, and the forest around me was finally quiet. I waited another hour after full sunrise before carefully emerging from my hiding spot. My legs barely supported me after being motionless for so long, and I had to hold on to the tree trunk while feeling returned to my extremities. The mud covering my body had dried into a hard crust that cracked and flaked off as I moved. I listened carefully for any sounds of the creatures, but heard only normal forest noises. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the gentle sound of water moving through the marsh. It seemed safe to begin moving again. My first priority was finding my way back to civilization. I still had no clear idea where I was relative to the trail system or any roads, but I knew that following water downstream would eventually lead me to larger waterways, and those usually led to human development. I started following the largest stream leading out of the marsh, staying in the water as much as possible to avoid leaving tracks. The mud covering had been partially washed away, but I reapplied it regularly to maintain my camouflage. I had no idea if the creatures were still searching for me, and I wasn't taking any chances. The stream led through increasingly familiar-looking forest. The trees were smaller here, and I began to see signs of human activity. Old blazes on trees, the remains of a trail marker, and eventually the sound of vehicles in the distance. I was approaching the road that led to the trailhead. As the sound of traffic grew louder, I felt a surge of relief unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Civilization was just ahead, safety was within reach. But I also felt a deep sadness and fear that would stay with me forever. I had seen something that shouldn't exist, encountered beings that science said were impossible, and barely escaped with my life. I emerged from the forest near the parking area where I'd left my car 3 days earlier. My vehicle was still there, covered with fallen leaves but undamaged. Other hikers in the parking lot stared at me in shock. I must have looked like a wild person covered in dried mud and torn clothing, eyes wide with exhaustion and trauma. I drove straight to the ranger station and tried to explain what had happened. The rangers listened politely but clearly thought I'd suffered some kind of breakdown or hallucination. They suggested I might have encountered bears, and that fear and isolation could play tricks on the mind. When I insisted on filing a report, they took down the basic details but seemed more concerned about my mental state than any actual threat in the forest. I never went back to look for the cabin or the cave. I never tried to find evidence or proof of what I'd experienced. Some part of me didn't want the validation. I preferred to let people think I'd imagined it all rather than face the reality of what was living in those remote woods. But I know what I saw. I know what held me captive and hunted me through the forest. Somewhere in the deep wilderness, there are creatures that science hasn't cataloged, beings that bridge the gap between human and animal in ways that challenge everything we think we know about evolution and the natural world. They're intelligent, organized, and perfectly adapted to their environment. They've probably been avoiding human contact for centuries, living in the most remote areas where we rarely venture. But as we continue to push deeper into the wilderness, encounters like mine may become more common. I still have nightmares about those hours in the cave, surrounded by bones and the smell of decay. I wake up remembering the feeling of that massive hand holding mine, testing my flesh like I was nothing more than a piece of meat. Sometimes I dream about the other people who didn't escape, whose remains are still scattered across that cave floor. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I moved away from Chicago, unable to handle the noise and crowds after experiencing true wilderness. I work from home now in a small town where I can see the forest from my window, but would never again venture into it alone. Because I know what's out there, watching from the shadows, and I know that not all of them are content to remain hidden forever. The truth is stranger and more terrifying than any campfire story or urban legend. We share this world with beings that exist at the very edge of myth and reality, creatures that our ancestors knew but that modern science has forgotten or dismissed. I think about the human skull I saw in that cave, yellowed with age, and wonder who that person was. Did they have family looking for them? Friends who reported them missing? Or were they like me, a solo adventurer who disappeared without a trace, written off as another unfortunate accident in the wilderness? The official statistics are sobering when you really look at them. Every year, hundreds of people vanish in national parks and forests across North America. Most are eventually found victims of falls, exposure, or getting lost. But a significant number simply disappear without any explanation, leaving behind no traces despite extensive search efforts. How many of those disappearances might have been encounters like mine that didn't end as fortunately? How many missing hikers, hunters, and campers became meals for creatures that officially don't exist? The thought keeps me awake at night, staring at my ceiling and remembering the systematic way those beings search for me in the marsh. I've done research since my experience, reading everything I can find about similar encounters. The stories are remarkably consistent across different regions and time periods. Large, bipedal, hair-covered creatures displaying intelligence and occasionally aggressive behavior toward humans. Most witnesses are dismissed as hoaxers or people suffering from misidentification, but the details they provide match my own experience too closely to be coincidental. The creatures I encountered weren't the gentle giants portrayed in some folklore. They were apex predators with human-level intelligence, capable of using tools, setting traps, and coordinating complex hunting strategies. The bone decorations and territorial markers I saw in their caves suggested a culture that had been developing for thousands of years, completely separate from human civilization. What disturbs me most is how perfectly adapted they seem to avoiding human detection. Their cave system was completely hidden from casual observation, accessible only through concealed entrances that you'd never find unless you knew exactly where to look. They moved through the forest with incredible stealth when they wanted to, leaving minimal traces of their presence. This suggests they've been sharing the wilderness with us for generations, carefully avoiding contact except when humans venture too far into their territory. My cabin was probably well within their hunting grounds, an intrusion they couldn't ignore. I was lucky they decided to investigate first rather than simply eliminating the threat immediately. The experience has given me a different perspective on wilderness safety. All the bear safety protocols and emergency preparedness in the world won't help you against intelligent predators who can think and plan. The standard advice about making noise to avoid surprising wildlife becomes meaningless when dealing with creatures that might be deliberately stalking you. I wonder sometimes if the old stories and legends were actually warnings passed down from previous generations who knew these creatures existed. Maybe our ancestors had protocols for dealing with them, knowledge that was lost as we became more urbanized and disconnected from the deep wilderness. The hardest part has been the isolation of keeping the secret. I can't share my experience with friends or family without sounding delusional. The few people I've tried to tell listen politely, but clearly think I suffered some kind of breakdown. Even my therapist suggests the trauma of being lost in the woods could have caused vivid hallucinations. But the physical evidence is real. The scars on my wrists from the vine bindings, the scratches from forcing my way through dense undergrowth during my escape, the lingering back pain from hours cramped in that hollow log. My body remembers what my mind sometimes tries to dismiss as impossible. I've considered going public with my story, reaching out to researchers who study these phenomena or journalists who cover unexplained mysteries. But what would be the point? Without physical proof, I'd just become another questionable witness in a field already full of hoaxes and misidentifications. And truthfully, part of me doesn't want these creatures to be discovered. If science confirmed their existence, what would happen next? Government expeditions to capture specimens? Tourist operations offering guided tours to encounter real Bigfoot? Logging companies claiming they need to clear more forest to protect public safety? The creatures I encountered have survived this long by remaining hidden. Human discovery might be the worst thing that could happen to them. So I keep quiet and live with the knowledge that somewhere in the remote forests of Minnesota, an ancient branch of the human family tree continues to exist. They hunt, they create tools, they have their own culture and territory. They've learned to coexist with modern civilization by remaining invisible, taking only what they need to survive. The worst part is knowing that my experience isn't unique. Right now, somewhere in North America, another hiker is probably setting up camp in what they think is empty wilderness. They're enjoying the peace and solitude, completely unaware that they're being observed by creatures that make no distinction between human and animal prey. But I know the truth. I know what's really out there, patient and intelligent and hungry. I know the human skull I saw in that cave once belonged to someone just like the person reading this story. Someone who thought they were safe in the modern world. Someone who believed the old legends were just folklore. I survived my encounter through a combination of luck, desperation, and the kind of primitive survival instincts we rarely need in civilized society. Not everyone will be so fortunate. The creatures are still out there, still hunting, still adding to their collection of bones and trophies. And they're getting hungrier. Maybe the old protocols existed for a reason. Maybe our ancestors knew to avoid certain areas, to travel in groups, to carry specific protections, or follow particular rituals when venturing into the deep woods. That knowledge has been lost, dismissed as superstition by our scientific age. All I can do is share my story and hope that someone, somewhere, takes it seriously enough to be more careful than I was. If you're planning a wilderness adventure, especially a solo trip, please consider the possibility that you might not be alone out there. Stick to established trails, carry emergency communication devices, and trust your instincts if something feels wrong. And if you ever find yourself hearing strange grunting sounds around your campsite in the middle of the night, don't investigate. Pack up and leave immediately, even if it means hiking in the dark. Whatever temporary discomfort or embarrassment you might face is nothing compared to becoming another set of bones in a hidden cave. Because once you're taken, once you wake up tied with vine ropes in a cave full of bones, your chances of survival become very, very small. I was lucky, I was prepared, I made the right choices at the right moments. Not everyone will. The creatures are patient, they're intelligent, they're perfectly adapted to their environment, and they're still out there waiting for the next lone hiker to venture too far into their territory. Don't let it be you. For more interesting stories, check this out.